Is this working?
Ladies, gentlemen, welcome back to your Bedroom Super Producer podcast. We are your hosts. My name is JT.
I'm BK.
And today we are going to jump right in. We want to talk about an unsung hero, a guy that's been building hip hop from its foundation all the way up to right now, the super current sounds of trap and hip hop. This guy is a multi-instrumentalist. He's a classically trained piano player. He's an incredible mixing engineer. He pretty much does it all. His name is Mike Dean.
That's right.
BK, what can you tell us about Mike Dean?
What can I tell you? Well, he's a keyboard extraordinaire.
He's a Moog aficionado, I think.
That's right. I think he was there since the beginning. I think the first stuff in 94 all the way to right now, 2000, speak for themselves. All the stuff that he did, Scarface stuff, the Juvenile stuff, Travis Scott stuff, I think speak all for themselves. And like you said, he's a very all-around type of cat. Because I think his first gig wasn't even as a producer. I think his first gig was as a keyboard player for Selena.
He was. And what I found really fascinating about Mike Dean is the fact that you can't really pinpoint his style of production.
True.
But whenever he lays a hand on a production or a record, you can really tell by the quality. Like if we go back all the way back to the Rap-A-Lot days, and again, shout out to Louis, who talked to me about Mike Dean at first, because actually maybe we should put a little bit of context on this whole thing. Mike Dean's a guy that you rarely talk about when you talk about like the top 10 or top 5 best producers of all time, but he's certainly in there. And so when he started, he really molded that Rap-A-Lot sound, like you said, like probably in the early 90s, maybe mid 90s. And if you listen to those records like Zero and Scarface and Bushwick Bill and all of these guys, the production quality and the mixing quality was way above average. I'm talking about even better than some of the early Dr. Dre stuff. And another thing that I found fascinating was that he probably was the first cat to actually get a bunch of different live players on rap records.
Yeah, right. He went like way beyond the whole sampling thing. You could see that he was a musician from the get-go.
Yeah. And there were no samples also at a time where New York rap was basically the king of the hill and it was all sampled.
Exactly, yeah.
And so for me, what fascinates me is, first of all, the drum mixing, which is extremely crisp, extremely tight.
Yeah, in your face.
Yeah, super clean, whereas the New York sound was more, dusty and old records, sampling, stuff like that. He had kind of the best of both worlds, where it didn't sound like a cheap Alesis drum machine, but it also didn't sound like just a chopped up, break
like a
beat.
drum loop, yeah.
Yeah.
Also, since he was from the South, because he's from Texas, right?
Houston, born and raised, I think.
You could see, like we were talking about in previous podcasts, that type of sound that he was trying to make the future. And even at the beginning with synths and different sounds of like pushing the envelope a little bit more.
Yeah, I guess his roots were a little bit in the West Coast sound with the synths, but you can definitely tell that he took the whole G-funk sound to a different level.
Exactly.
I also read somewhere that he actually met all of the, was it Funkadelic or G-funk? who's Bernie Worrell playing for? He's the synth
Um,
player for Funkadelic.
I think Funkadelic. Not sure.
Yeah,
Someone in the comments will
but he
correct
was
us.
basically down with these guys and hanging out outside of shows
Really,
and stuff like that. So you can tell that he really studied like the
the
pioneers.
pioneers, right?
Yeah, and like you said, he's a keyboardist extraordinaire. Again, I read somewhere that he has studied classical piano for 18 years.
Wow. But you can see it if anyone, like even today, if you see the Moog videos that he's been doing, you see that he's trained. He hasn't learned to play with like two fingers. If you take a look at I think for all you Moog heads out there, like if you take a look at 3 Joules and Grand Faucon, I think, like
Yeah,
he did 2 videos where he just spends time in at the factory.
yeah.
It's you can see that he's trained. He's got some chops.
He does. And that's something that for the beginners out there, and also for the experts, and something that I talk about in my book, The Bedroom Super Producer, it's the fact that Mike Dean's such an excellent example of putting your musical ego aside, because this
Mhm.
guy can go on like playing 18 notes a second if he wants to, but he can also dumb it down to where he'll produce, trap records for Travis Scott, and
Mhm.
you won't be able to tell that the guy literally is a prodigy on the piano.
Exactly. Also, I think he's very open minded as a person
Yeah.
because he's an old school, coming from, like we said, the back in the days of 90, 93, 94, and back in like playing in bands with Selena. At the same time, he's doing, I think, something with the Smoke Perp, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
all the new stuff, and if we even go back, the Kanye stuff, it's so he's been able to adapt his style and himself to the different years where he was working, and like you said, he's very much all over the place. If you take a look at his like production credits and everything, it's not. I think he's doing production the way it was supposed to be made and not the way they define it today. Because today production is mostly defined in terms of you made the beat,
Yeah. And it sounds like
and then
you.
oh, you're the producer, you made the beat. For him, it's totally different. He can have contributed in terms of engineering. He can have contributed in terms of mixing, in terms of producing, in terms of arranging.
Absolutely.
It's very like a multifaceted way of the way production was done before. Okay, like today, it's not just like putting drums on the sample, like you said, and then giving it to the like a producer or whatever, the arranger, and then forget about it, and then it appears somewhere on a Spotify, and you're like, hey, I'm a producer. I wrote down this beat. So that's why I think it's his longevity has been linked to that. If you take, let's say, everything that he did for Kanye, um, there's a lot of stuff that he's not even mentioned on. I think it's 808 and Heartbreak. He's not
Yeah.
even mentioned as a producer, but he played on a lot of tracks. I think he engineered some stuff. He mixed some stuff. So I think
Yeah, and you can tell that the more he works with Kanye, the more intricate the way the songs are built it becomes.
exactly.
The more actually Kanye gave him leeway to bring in his creative input, the better his albums become. And I was listening to some Yeezus studying for this episode, and honestly, the song that they produced with Daft Punk is genius. Like
Oh, it's awesome.
I found it so ear tiring the first few times I listened to Yeezus when they first came out, but you got to give it to them. Like they were way in advance in
Ahead,
terms of the
like ahead, and like
the
and
distorted 808s,
of
the
course they were
minimalism.
really ahead of their times in terms of it was sounds that, like, I remember even when we were producing sounds that rappers would say, I don't like it. Oh, it doesn't sound like X. Oh, I want something more like this or something more like that. And they had the guts to put those sounds that people didn't feel to become like the guys who started it all. Like,
Yeah.
the 808 and Heartbreak is based on, they went back, they used like the TR-808. They
Yeah.
used like basic sounds from that drum machine. So it was kind of coming back full circle and showing the people today that you could do something totally different with those machines.
Yeah. I found another very interesting point that he made in an interview, Mike Dean, that is, and he was saying that he'd bring, the more and more Kanye would trust him, the more he'd bring musical ideas he'd worked on his own, and Kanye would probably take like 20% of whatever he brought to the table. But the way he comments on it, he's like, yeah, it doesn't matter what if Kanye says no. I'll just keep saying, okay, let's try this, let's try that. So you can just really commend the guy for going back to the studio with a guy like Kanye, who's, I would say, probably very difficult to work with. You need a lot of creativity
Well,
and stamina to.
he has a pretty specific idea or of where he wants like a record to go. So in a way, when you're producing for him, when you're producing with him, has to be a little bit difficult to finding the right ideas that fit that. It's kind of like showing different colors to a painter, and then
Yeah.
he says, well, no, not that yellow, no, this is too yellow, oh no, this is too orangey. And when you have this specific vision, it's not always, and when you're not, like, let's say, classically trained or anything, it's sometimes difficult to explain exactly what you want, the word you want the song to go, because usually it's based on a feeling and on a, like what we were talking earlier, like a color that you see, and it's not quite that color that you see. Those sounds don't match what you imagine in your head.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that's the way you make a record. You try stuff out and you merge them together to have these 10 to 12 songs that are cohesive together.
But I think we still both grew tired of not being able to have a good, technically sound dialogue with artists and still figure out what they have in their heads and really bring technique and knowledge, both musical and from a mixing engineering standpoint, and create that vision. Whereas Mike Dean seems to enjoy that process of not knowing, experimenting, and then finding out what
finding something
a guy
specific.
like Kanye has in mind.
That's a really a strong facet of his personality. I think that's a secret of like why he's still here today.
Yeah, and I mean,
and now he's like, they're pretty much a band. He's on tour with them. He plays keyboard at his gigs, and so he's done it all. Like keyboard musician, on stage musician, mixing engineer, producing, writing credits, all that with Kanye. So
yeah. Another thing that I find very interesting is when he talked about, and very matter of factly actually, about their mixing process with Kanye. And he would say, and we've done that also in the past, where Mike Dean will probably do the first pass, get a song to a certain level, and then Kanye will ask for such and such big names to go after them. And sometimes they'll go back and maybe use the drum mixing from one of the guys, maybe Mike Dean's, and then the vocals from whoever, and then the synthesizers and instruments from a third mixing engineer. And the way he describes it is like he doesn't care. He doesn't care if his name is all across the whole mixing or he's helped just at the beginning process.
Well, he's making music at the same time. Sometimes we as artists are a little bit too artsy.
Right.
You want to preserve that purity of what you did, and you had a specific idea in mind, and everything fits together this way. But this might have worked maybe, I don't know, 15, 20, 30 years ago. But today with collaboration, the way it is, the way you can just trade in digital file over the web, the way everyone collaborates with everyone, all the mixing engineers want to have a little piece of the pie, want to be on an album, like a big name, a little name, a featuring here and there. You kind of have to have the philosophy of just like to be glad to have participated into a concept
Right.
and not like hug like want to have like, oh, I want 50% of the pie. It's my record with Kanye, you know? So he has the right attitude. He just wants to keep making music, he wants to stay creative. He wants to just keep throwing ideas at them. He just does music, and maybe people would produce more and be more successful if they had that open-minded attitude like that today.
Yeah. I guess he's gotten better at getting paid for all of that also.
Well, he's got to that. Maybe that's why he doesn't care, because there's, you know,
Yeah, because
it's not gonna be $50. It's gonna take.
another producer was asking him somewhere, I read that what would be like the best piece of advice you could give to up and coming producers or people getting started in the game. And instead of, saying something like, learn an instrument or something like that, he said, read all of the books you can find on music business, like the business aspect
Yeah.
of music. And I found that very interesting. And he actually segued that into talking about a bit of his beginnings, where he basically didn't get paid for 15 years producing hit records for other artists. So I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, because at first you're focused on making quality music. You're focused on having a good relationship with the artist. And if you don't like make a conscious efforts to get your dues, people are gonna take advantage of it. And if they can get the good stuff for free, they're gonna keep getting the good stuff for free. You know.
Well, if you don't ask,
it's like in anything.
If you don't ask for your worth,
oh, exactly, they're gonna say, "Oh, he does it for free."
It's not so much that people don't want to pay you; it's just that they won't think about it either.
Exactly, you have to think about you, basically.
But would you start your career by learning the business ins and outs, or actually understanding how to produce music? That's why I think that there was a bit of frustration behind that statement, because it can't become a problem if you don't even have the resources to produce hit records in the first place.
I wouldn't necessarily start a career by thinking about like the whole business as per se, but I would probably do it in parallel.
Of course,
Say you can learn about music and learn, say, a little bit about like royalties and a little bit about publishing and a little bit about like, and you don't necessarily have to read books about like the music biz. It can be like biographies about artists, what happened to them, how they do things, like reading about, I don't know, Ray Charles or Quincy Jones. It gives you like a good idea of like how the business works, and then you can branch out and say, oh, I need to learn a little bit about publishing. Oh, I need to learn a little bit about, but at the same time, you still have to culture that love for making the music. You have to have something to sell. You have to have something to excite artists with. No,
you got to start with a passion. And to all of our listeners out there, you need to get your hands on both Ray Charles and Quincy Jones's biographies. Those are incredible, mind-blowing music business books.
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, he also talked about the importance of understanding, publishing and points and stuff like that. And to my knowledge, there aren't too many books on that. Like, I mean, I read Donald Passman, The Music Business, or whatever the title is, but understanding how copyrights are managed on the publishing end is kind of
it's difficult.
An inexact science. Like, nobody really knows. I've seen, record label owners not understanding how it works, TV producers not understanding how it works. So you really have to dig deep.
Of course.
To my knowledge, again, I don't think there's a book out there to really teach you that stuff. So,
and it changes from country to country, and
I guess it does. Right?
And it has to do with so many things. Even I think from state to state in the United States, it changes a little bit.
It does?
It changes in terms of depending with which artist you work with. If it's someone younger, do you get all the child child labor laws and all that
Mm.
stuff. It's so I think that's for like another podcast and maybe something more in depth. I think even we don't understand it that well. For on my side of things,
We could go on forever about
forever.
this aspect because so much pain has come
Mm.
from learning
Of
the hard
course.
way.
Yeah.
Let's switch gears and let's talk about a little bit of his equipment and what he uses. And I was actually very pleased to hear that nowadays he still does the mixing on Pro Tools, but does all of his like composition and production on Ableton Live. And I thought that was a great combo. But I got a question for you. Why do you think these old cats and big studio users still mix on Pro Tools?
I think that Pro Tools it's mostly the quality of the plugins. I think there's still like some difference. The different converters. It's still the pro stuff, and it's mostly because all the big studios have always had that, so they keep upgrading that.
Right.
And it's a way to have to be compatible all over the place. You go to a studio in New York, you have the Pro Tools, you get the Pro Tools session. You go to LA, you still have the Pro Tools sessions. Your stems are in there. I think it's a lot about compatibility.
Yeah,
but
that
in
makes
terms
sense.
of working and in terms of composing, you can use anything you want. But at the end of the day, you want that common standard that everyone has.
Right.
Before, I think there was really a bigger difference between the, I don't know if you remember the times what like the plugins, there were like TDM plugins that were a little bit high, like hardcore, and there was like the lower class, like more like cheaper stuff. Today I think it's less of an issue.
Exactly, because when I hear, producers using such and such DAWs, I always think in terms of, do they achieve a better sounding result? But I think, like you said, it becomes more a way to be compatible with
I think it's more
your
compatible.
coworkers
Yeah.
and wherever you're working out of whatever studio you're at. You can just pull up the Pro Tools studio, Pro Tools session, because that's what they have.
Exactly.
And they probably all have all of the plugins that you're using. So
exactly. So
yeah,
like before, you could say that it was also the sound cards that you could connect to the Pro Tools that were of higher quality. But now you can connect pretty much any sound card, and you can connect Apogees to Ableton Live. You can, like, pretty much any converter is going to work with Ableton. Before, I think the Pro Tool rigs it was something a little bit more beefed up. The converters were better. So
right. So that changed probably, would you say like 10 years ago, something like that? Maybe a bit
I
more?
think it started to get better, like 10, maybe. Because I don't know if you remember, but back then, you couldn't even use Pro Tools without hardware, Pro Tools hardware.
Right.
And at some point, they made a deal with, I think it was M Audio, and they were the first,
Right.
the other sound card. You could use an M Audio sound card and run Pro Tools with it. And then they just opened it up. And today you can use, if you have like an Apogee sound card, you can still use the Pro Tools. Before, it was really, you had to have the hardware to use the software. You couldn't have just the software and choose your sound card.
You just reminded me that I used to work on Pro Tools M powered.
That's right.
The first version of Pro Tools for M Audio users. Wow.
Yep. Long time ago.
Didn't last long. I switched to Logic in a matter of months.
Logic was more flexible.
Yeah. So let's close out this segment on Mike Dean. I personally will invite all of you guys to listen to the song Smile by, I think it's Scarface featuring Tupac. If you're interested in the old Mike Dean, the great Mike Dean, listen to that song. That's like really the perfect representation of everything that we've talked about, from the mixing, the drum programming, the live instruments, the G-funk, but more futuristic sound that they had at that time.
Yeah.
And so that's, for me, that's the song that actually made me like Scarface, because I wasn't a big fan of those Texas rappers at the time. You know, I was more of a Wu-Tang and
Yeah, of course.
Das FX fan, or even a Cypress Hill and maybe Snoop Dogg at the time, but not so much the Rap-A-Lot cats. But when you look at it in retrospect, that's just such a classic that if you want to discover the old Mike Dean, you should start there and work your way up. So today we have something special, and we're working with this new formula, and we decided to give you a bit of pick our brains a bit and come up with a mixing tip and a producer tip, so that you can go back after listening to our podcast and try to incorporate that into your workflow. So what do you have for us this week, BK, in terms of mixing?
I have something. For us, it was a trick that we learned like a while back. It was a trick from our mixing the engineer handbook.
Yes,
you remember that?
Of course.
We still consulted
another
regularly.
Groundbreaking
Exactly, by
book.
Bobby Wazinski.
Yeah.
And I remember one trick that I think I still use today, and it's a compression trick. And I'm sure you're gonna.
I see where you're going with this, but enlighten us, BK.
So the mixing tip this week, it's called the New York City compression trick. And it's supposedly something that all the engineers in New York back in the days, they would do to have a more tight sound.
And the disco engineers, I think, too.
Yeah, I think so. It came from that. It's pretty easy, basically. You create a separate channel, and basically what you're going to do is you're going to feed any other channel from your mix into that separate channel. So basically you're creating
either a mix bus,
exactly,
or a complete duplicate of a track.
Exactly. So you're going to be sending, the trick here is you're going to be sending part of your signal to that channel. So you're going to be basically combining the two signals. Right? Okay. On that separate channel, what you're going to do, you're going to put a compressor. Pretty much any compressor works. And you're going to adjust the compressor to act almost as a limiter. So something in the range of 10-to-1 compression, 11, 12-to-1 compression.
So the highest ratio, basically.
Exactly. So
a very high ratio.
You're going to be squishing your sound, like really.
Gotcha.
Like squishing your sound. Like basically like a limiter. You want your compressor to act super fast, so it catches the transient pretty fast, and you want like a long release. So you want to keep that sound squished. And basically what you want to do, you're going to feed your initial channel in it. Let's say we're talking about drums.
Yes.
Because we use it mostly on drums. You can use it on anything, but we use it mostly on drums.
It's more pleasing on drums.
It's really something that, for me, that I apply a lot on the rhythm section. It gives that tightness to the rhythm section. So you're going to send your drums into that track, and then you're going to squish the hell out of it, of course. And then you're going to blend with your initial track, the one that you haven't touched. You're going to blend the signal of the squished signal. And so you get that balance, to get that rounded off, to have that really tight sound, while still keeping the dynamics of the original track, because you could have basically put the compressor on the original track, but we don't want that. We want a squished signal. We want a signal that has no effect on it, and you want to combine those in a type of parallel compression. And you're going to put just enough of that amount to get that kick, that tightness sound that you want, while conserving the cleanliness of the original track.
And it's also a great way to, avoid the over compressed sound of certain records today, where you keep, like you said, the transients from the original track and just blend in the destroyed second track
Exactly.
or the copy. Very interesting. So if you want to dig deeper on that trick, you can Google New York compression trick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or some people will call it parallel compression.
Exactly.
That's roughly the same idea. But usually parallel compression just means that you'll be using that compression on the original track. So you have to know the difference between the New York compression trick and just plain old parallel compression.
Exactly.
Right. All right. So allow me to talk about drums again with my
Drums.
producer.
Is that the only thing that exists?
I
in
don't know,
music?
but
We love drums.
it's been a very big part of our music discovery because you're always looking for better ways to
We need that
have those
kick-ass
crazy drums. Yeah. So in this week, I want to emphasize the importance of tuning your drum samples because I'll always remember when I went to some of my friends who were drummers and they'd have their drum sets in the basement and I wanted to sit down at the set and play and they would tell me, you can play, but it's not tuned, so it will sound like shit. And they would never really allow me to play the drum set unless it was tuned. And I never got it because to me, you would tune a guitar or you would tune a piano, but I never really understood that the metal keys, the metal thingies on the sides of the drums were actually screws that you would tighten or loosen to get the perfect tone on your toms, snare, bass drum, etc., etc. And I think that this knowledge has been lost with computer musicians quite a bit because you have just the samples and then you'll just use whatever sample you like from a texture or transient perspective, and that'll be that.
Mhm.
And what I think that beginner and even intermediate producers sometimes overlook is the fact that you can do any crazy compression trick on your drums, but if they're not tuned, you will never get the most out of a drum sample.
Yeah, true.
So what I do usually, and it's a lot DAW dependent, DAW dependent, and it's the fact that because I'm using Ableton Live, I'm able to tune whatever wave sample I put on a track very, very easily and conveniently. And so what I do usually is I'll start with probably a kick drum that I like. And as soon as I add a bass line or some chords, I'll move my kick up an octave to really hear the resonant frequency.
Mhm.
And by moving it up an octave, you really hear the note, and then you can, move it up or down a few semitones. And once you lock in with the right root note, you move it back
You
down
move it
an
back down,
octave.
yeah.
And then that way you make sure that your kick will be in the key of your song. But then I go further than that. I do it on this snare also, or on a clap.
Oh, interesting.
And even the hi-hats now and the shakers, I'll try to find, something that's more pleasing to the ear.
Mhm.
Just by moving it up a few semitones or down a few semitones.
Yeah.
And that way, I don't spend time on compression or, EQing any of those sounds before I really get what I would call the most musical result.
Mhm. So basically, you're placing them in the sound spectrum with each of like their frequency, their notes,
Exactly.
kind of like an orchestra that you have the violins and you have the bass and you have all the different instruments that have their own spaces because back then there were no EQs. So you're gonna place them in the soundscape before you start to use a knife EQs to like gouge a space for them. And if you do your job correctly, you're gonna have a limited amount of work to do in terms of compression and EQing.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's what the producers of, the 60s, 70s, and
Mhm.
80s did.
Yeah.
When they, positioned the mics and tuned the drums. And, I think that they did a lot of that prep work
Mhm.
before recording and obviously before mixing their records, and that's why they sound so good sometimes.
Well, basically, like since like back in the days, stuff was recorded sometimes all together. They almost did the mix by the way they recorded stuff and the way they would place the musicians at a certain spot in the room to have that perfect tonal balance and to limit a little bit the bleeding, to not have to go back in the mix. And so basically they had to do that because technology wasn't advanced enough that they could do that in post-production. So you had to record it correctly. Today you can record it poorly and then fix it, but it's still difficult. It's kind of like mastering a bad mix, right?
Well, as they say, you cannot necessarily fix it at the mix. Usually, if it sucks, it sucks, and it's just a pain in the ass to try to mix it in.
Yeah, and it's never going to be. It can become a good mix, but it's never going to be a great mix.
Exactly.
Right?
And I think that's the big difference. Like you say, it's going to go from good to great in a matter of seconds once you figure out in your DAW how to basically pitch shift any sound on any track. So if you're using Ableton, it's very easy. Logic, the algorithm sucks, but it can still be done on the channel. What's it called? I can't remember. Upper left corner. Yeah. Once you have selected a track, you can see there that you can move up and down the sounds by semitones. And then another great way to achieve that is to just use a good drum sampler, something like Battery or even Contact.
You can pitch shift directly in the engine.
Yeah, exactly. So pitch your drums, ladies and gentlemen. It'll go a long way to improve your mixes, improve your creative flow, because you don't get stuck on, this snare is so good, but somehow it doesn't fit the track, that kind of issue. So that was my tip for the day.
Well, great tip.
And thank you. Your tip was great also. I think that with just those two, people will get some
I think it's
banging,
simple tips,
loud drums.
But I think stuff that can go a long way.
Very long way. So this was our show for today. If you want to get in contact with us, you can comment on the YouTube version of this podcast. If you like the show, we invite you also to rate it a 5-star on Apple Podcasts. We want to get the word out there, and we want to get as many listeners as possible. So help us with a little 5-star review if you feel like it. And if they want to support the channel, BK, what else can our awesome listeners do?
Well, the same thing that you've been talking about, same thing for Spotify. They can rate us there. Like you said, YouTube channel, leave your comments. Instagram channel, the same thing.
Yes.
The Facebook channel, same thing. Like we said, delicatebeats.com. And also, I'd like to invite everyone to visit that website, grab the newsletter, put your email there, check out the kits, the different presets that we sell, the contact kits, and plenty of free stuff available for everyone to test out the stuff that we've been making.
Both our serum and contact stuff you can get for free if you subscribe to the newsletter.
Exactly.
So that's a great way to, get a little bit of weekend inspiration for your next banger.
Yeah, and I think that's a wrap for this week.
Yeah, I'm JT.
I'm BK.
And we'll see you guys in the next one.
Peace out.